Good day, and welcome to a programming partnership between the Chesapeake Food Shed Network and the Pennsylvania Farmers Union. My name is Yona Sipos, and I'm the program director for the Chesapeake Food Shed Network. I work through Local Concepts LLC, a consulting firm that provides development and backbone support. Before our main event today, I'll provide a brief overview of the CFN and mention a few other webinars and food system activities coming up this summer. And then I'll provide a brief orientation to Zoom, which is the platform that we're using for the webinar today. I will just bring up my slides now. Sorry about that. Okay, the Chesapeake Food Shed Network is a regional network that covers 6 states and Washington, D.C. within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The mission of the CFN is to catalyze connections and collaborations that help build a sustainable, resilient, inclusive, equitable, and regional food system within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We believe that by catalyzing connections and collaborations, we are better positioned to accelerate change in and across our food system. And I realize that I'm not quite in slide mode. Sorry about that. I am having a little technical difficulty, which is tough because I'm supposed to get the technical stuff. I think I'm finally sorted out here. So just to get back on track, I'll just share with you that the explicit aim of the Chesapeake Food Shed Network, or the CFN, is to grow connections and get to know one another, share information and knowledge, build trust and relationships with the thought that as we know one another better, we might over time see opportunities to align, collaborate, and contribute to collective impact. The Chesapeake Food Shed Network has been developing over the last 2.5 years among those out there doing the extraordinary work to advance our regional food system. If you participate in or support that extraordinary work, as well as the vision of a regional, sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and equitable food system, please participate in the Chesapeake Food Shed Network. The CFN is open and free of charge to organizations, businesses, funders, agencies, and other change agents working across the Chesapeake Bay watershed to build a stronger and more resilient food system. Please visit us at chesapeakefoodshed.net to find out more. Finally, before sharing a few housekeeping items for utilizing Zoom, I'll note that the CFN has a range of food system programming coming up this summer, and everyone is welcome. In fact, we have a webinar this Thursday about food recovery within Maryland as an example of statewide organizing that we think will be relevant to everybody within our food shed and even beyond. And later on this month, we have a webinar about a blueprint for a national food strategy that might be of interest to others on this call. For more information, as I said, on these and other programs, please check our website. And if the information isn't up yet, it will be soon. On to Zoom, which is the software that we use for our webinars. If you take your mouse and hover it at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a Zoom control panel with various options. The most important one is the Q&A option. We invite you to click on the Q&A icon to open it and type in your questions at any point throughout the presentation. And Heidi Secord from the Pennsylvania Farmers Union, who I'll be turning this over to in just a moment, she will be collecting your questions and moderating the Q&A throughout the presentation if appropriate, and certainly at the end when we have a question and answer period following the presentations. With that, I'll just say that I'm really delighted that the CFN is able to partner with the Pennsylvania Farmers Union, and I'm going to turn it over to Heidi to tell you a little bit more about the PFU.
Thank you so much, Yona. We're excited to be partnering with Chesapeake Food Shed Network to put on this webinar and welcome everyone today. Farmers Union is a grassroots 501c4 organization. It's producer driven. I'm the Pennsylvania Farmers Union state president. And let's see, sharing screen, here we go. And we'll give you a little glimpse of our website there. We represent over 200,000 farm and ranch families nationally. The key to our success and credibility has been Farmers Union's grassroots structure, in which policy positions are initiated locally. And Farmers Union believes that a vibrant and prosperous family farm system, one that relies on each of us to play a role in creating it, is sound ag policy and the basis for thriving communities. And we achieve this through education, cooperation, and ag policy, both statewide and nationally. We ask you to consider becoming a member of Farmers Union. Check out our website, check out our membership benefits and activities. So today we are presenting information on the Local Food Safety Collaborative through our webinars. The Local Food Safety Collaborative project is aimed at enabling local produce growers and processors to comply with the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is funded through a grant from the Food and Drug Administration. As a component to Pennsylvania Farmers Union's task of our outreach drive, we are offering this two-part webinar series on navigating the food safety landscape, a practitioner's guide to the basics of produce food safety and the Food Safety Modernization Act. Today we are presenting part 1, Demystifying the Food Safety Landscape. On Friday, May 19th, between 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be offering part 2, Where to Begin and On-Farm Lessons Learned. The instructors for the webinar today are Lindsay Gilmore and Jeff Stoltzfus. Lindsay Gilmore is the owner of Organic Planet LLC and serves as a food systems consultant and as a personal chef. Lindsay has over 35 years experience in the food industry and has worked with farmers for over 13 years to develop efficiencies and systems to meet the demands of the wholesale marketplace. Her current focus is assisting farmers with food safety compliance, and she's qualified as a USDA internal auditor for the harmonized standards and is a qualified trainer for the FDA produce safety rule. Lindsay has a particular interest and experience in helping farmers work together to achieve food safety certification. From 2013 to 2015, she managed a group gap pilot in Pennsylvania for Fair Food Philadelphia, successfully shepherding more than 120 Amish and Mennonite farmers through USDA Group Gap certification. She is currently managing a project in Mississippi for the Wallace Center at Windrock International, creating a USDA-approved single entity management food safety model as a viable solution for under-resourced small farm cooperative. She continues to work with farmers and orchardists individually and in groups, helping them to overcome their trepidation and develop food safety programs that make sense for them. Also joining us after Lindsay was Jeff Stoltzfus from Penn State Extension, Lancaster County. He's a farm food safety educator. He's spent the past 23 years as a farmer educator with the Eastern Lancaster County School District, working primarily with vegetable farmers. He's helped farmers start an onion growing cooperative and work with them in the areas of production and food safety. Jeff is a certified Produce Safety Alliance lead trainer, and he lives on a small farm and grows strawberries, pumpkins, and beef cattle. It's now my pleasure to kick off part 1, Demystifying the Food Safety Landscape, by introducing Lindsay Gilmore.
Thank you, Heidi. I should say that the Group Gap project that I managed with Jeff. So Jeff and I got to spend an awful lot of time together talking about food safety, and we call each other constantly with questions. So let's get started. So we're going to do our best to, yeah, I'm running 2 screens here. Hold on one sec. Why is that not working? Hang on. Let me do it. Oh, I have to do it here. Okay. Technology, always a fun thing. So the food safety landscape can be very confusing. Jeff and I and all our food safety colleagues spend a lot of time trying to explain it to people. Oftentimes that makes it more confusing, but Today, we really want to try and help you forge a path through all of this, do our best to explain the most important pieces. And then we'll have time actually throughout this presentation and at the end to answer questions. So if you have questions specifically on things that we're saying, we'll try and answer those as we go. Anything else we will save to the end and answer then as best we can. So first of all, this is probably familiar to most of you at this point, but it's always worth reiterating. The reason that produce food safety is happening is that the statistics show that the number of illnesses caused each year by fruits and vegetables is greater than for any other type of food. And that continues. This information was from 2011, but this continues. And while it seems really surprising because fruits and vegetables should be the most nourishing thing we eat, unfortunately, it is a truth. Now, it's not usually the fruits and vegetables themselves that cause the illness. It's contamination of those products, mostly from human or animal feces and mostly through human error or ignorance. And of course, pathogens in human and animal feces or animal poop are equal opportunity offenders. They don't care if your farm is organic or biodynamic or aeroponic or hydroponic. To some extent, of course, growing in a more sustainable manner helps for a lot of reasons and may even, and I'll talk a little bit about that, may even help to prevent foodborne illness, but it isn't a surefire prevention of foodborne illness. So just to scare you, really, in response to this idea that fruits and vegetables cause illness and death, there are all kinds of entities that have come into being, many, many, many all around the world, throughout the United States. In response to this proliferation of scientists, universities, government agencies, industry partnerships, NGOs, and for-profit companies, and they've devised food safety standards and risk management tools, audit schemes, certification systems, training programs, etc. Some of them are focused more on the needs of farmers, and some are more focused on the needs of the food industry, but you can see that the terrain is very crowded. Oh, there goes another one. And then along comes the Food Safety Modernization Act. So all of this stuff in the past, all of these folks here, most of them, they came into being before the Food Safety Modernization Act was even conceived of. So you can see that food safety was something that was being required of farmers before there was any legislation. And we're going to go through some of the basics of the FSMA produce safety rule and preventative controls today. But we want to help you to understand the difference between getting a GAP certification and complying with the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule. They're two different things. They have a lot in common, but they are really two different things. So the fact that this FSMA regulation has come along is really out of consumer and industry concern. They put pressure on the government to come up with legislation that gave the FDA much greater powers, really unprecedented powers, and of course a very small budget to regulate the food industry. So for many people now in the produce industry, this means that food safety is not just a business choice, it is a law. Previously it was voluntary, previously it was a market decision. Now for many folks it has become required by law that you put in place certain food safety protocols. Here. So today we're going to go through three different things, just some basics on GAPs or GAP. Jeff is going to go through what's voluntary, what's market driven, and then a larger portion on what FSMA, what the law is all about. And then we'll just quickly go through what happens what do you need to think about and what do you need to do if your customer requires GAP certification. So we're going to start with GAP basics. Oh, let me go back a sec there. We're going to look at the acronyms. Sorry, I'm flipping around because I'm doing two screens. We're going to look at the acronyms and terminology that you may have heard already. Some of it can be very confusing. I try I hope that this helps to get people less confused. If it makes you more confused, I'm apologizing ahead of time. But the more you hear this stuff, I prefer that you understand what it is when you hear it than that you get confused when you hear it. So we start with GAP or GAPS, Good Agricultural Practices. So these, it's become kind of a catch-all acronym for practices and procedures that reduce food safety risk, but it is very specifically for produce farms, not for manufacturing, not for aggregating and storing food. It really is for what happens on the farm. And notice that I say reduce risk, procedures that reduce risk. You really can't say that you are eliminating food safety risk. Your insurance agent would hate you for it, probably. So, and along with GAP, there's all these other, this is just a small sampling of the acronyms that are out there, and you may have heard some of them. GAP, GIP is actually good agricultural practices and good handling practices. There's an audit program that the USDA has called GAP, GIP. GMPs, good manufacturing practices that are applied to warehousing, processing, storage, transportation. Those, if you've done the preventative controls training, you will have heard of GMPs used there. And then the standard operating procedures, sanitation standard operating procedures, and so on. There's a whole bunch of stuff. You just have to figure out what applies to you and begin to understand what they all stand for. So let's start with food safety standard. This is a set of specific requirements, rules, and procedures that are believed to reduce the risk of foodborne illness. And when you're developing your food safety plan, it's good to know which food safety standard you need to comply with, and you can use that standard to help you write your plan. And there are many food safety standards out there. This happens to be the USDA Field Operations and Harvesting Harmonized, well, I'm sorry, this is the Field Operations and Harvesting Harmonized Food Safety Standard, which the USDA and a couple of other organizations have used to create audit programs. Just a quick aside, in the US, produce food safety is almost exclusively concerned with human pathogens or microbiological contamination. But complying with food safety standards and using sustainable farming methods are not mutually exclusive. And the Wild Farm Alliance has come up with some great publications and some great information on how conservation practices can help protect water and air quality and support pollinators and wildlife, as we all like to do, all while reducing the risk of contamination. So if you go onto that website, you can get some really good information on that, because you can use it as an argument in your food safety plan if you want to continue to have wildlife habitat and riparian barriers and so on. And there are a couple of audit programs in the US now that combine food safety standards with ecological growing methods and worker welfare. Global Gap is actually a European entity, not a company, it's an NGO. They have their integrated farm assurance standard, which includes the more sustainable growing methods and worker welfare. And the Equitable Food Initiative is something that's starting to get some interest here in the United States. They're a US company, I think they're a for-profit. And they actually have farmers and their workers work together to create programs that are equitable for everybody. I really like that program. And Costco is one of the companies that's starting to adopt the EFI, and also Red Tomato up in Massachusetts. So if you're interested in that, you may want to check out their website. Now let's look at food safety audit programs. So this is a set of requirements based on the food safety standards. So as I said, the standards the standard is a set of requirements, and then the audit program is based on that set of requirements. And you as the operator or the farmer must be seen to comply with these standards to pass your audit. So here's the USDA acceptance criteria for their harmonized food safety standard. USDA is one of several entities that's adopted and developed this third-party audit program. Global Gap is another one that has the harmonized food safety audit program as well. And then the audit checklist is what the auditor uses when they come onto your farm to audit your farm. And this I don't know if we go back to that previous one. Hang on. All the way back there. You can see that the audit checklist actually uses the same section numbers, etc., as the food safety standard does. And then if you go to the food safety manual, this particular food safety manual, again, uses the same section numbers, the same questions as the standard and the auditor's checklist. So this just makes it easier for the auditor if you do it this way. And if you want to, then you need a food safety plan if you want to be food safety certified, and it has two main components. So the the food safety manual, I should say, has two main components: this food safety plan, and then the next thing is records and documentation to show that you're following the plan. These are things like the logs, the water test results, chemical application records, and so on. And this can be the hardest concept for most people to accept and implement because it adds to your workload. But auditors will say if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So you really do need to have these records if you want to get food safety certified. There's just no way of getting around it. Then the next thing is certification body, or CBs, if sometimes heard them referred to as. That's the agency that comes out and does a third-party audit of your farm. In some cases, the certifying body owns and audits its own food safety programs. So the USDA owns and audits its own food safety programs. But another entity, Primus GFS, which is a for-profit that owns an audit program, actually uses 6 independent approved certifying bodies. So the entity that owns the audit program is independent somewhat of the certifying bodies. It's a way of, they feel, of avoiding conflict of interest. But the fact that the USDA owns and audits its own programs does mean that they tend to be less expensive. And Jeff and I primarily work with the USDA audit programs, and we feel that it's definitely, it's rigorous enough, and we don't really see a conflict of interest, but it really depends on what your customer requires you to do. Now, one thing that I hear people say sometimes is that their farm or their customer requires them to be GFSI certified, or that their farm is GFSI certified. GFSI stands for Global Food Safety Initiative. It's an international standard for food safety program benchmarking. It's not a food safety program or a certifying body. It's an industry partnership that provides assurance that a food safety scheme or food safety program meets baseline criteria. So if your buyer requires you to be GFSI certified, it means, where am I? It means that they want you to be certified by one of several audit programs that meet the GFSI benchmark. So Canada GAP, Global GAP, and Primus GFS are examples of 3 food safety audit programs that are GFSI benchmarked. Now, USDA, I was going to add to that the USDA harmonized audit program is in the process of being GFSI benchmarked. Hopefully that will happen soon. They add a global marketing addendum for customers such as Walmart, that require something that gets them closer to GFSI benchmarking. So if you have a customer that says, we want you to be GFSI audited, and you're using the USDA, it's possible that they may allow you to continue to work with the USDA auditing as long as you add in the global marketing addendum. That could be just more confusing, and I apologize if it is. And then one final link in the chain, sometimes if you're using, sometimes your customer will require you to use a supply chain data management platform. And usually it's the larger buyers that require this. It's generally an additional cost for the farmer. It's great. It's just a way of getting all that information easily traced and accessible to the buyers and all of their all of their people. There's a great example of vertical integration in the industry, which is Azul, Azul Dynamic Data, actually is part of the Azul Supply Chain Management Company, which owns Primus GFS audit scheme and Primus Labs that develop the audit scheme. And a certifying body, so in Primus Labs, which is a certifying body, and has contracts with big companies like Cisco. So if you want to sell to Cisco, you have to audit to the Primus GFS standard. You have to go through one of their certifying bodies, and you have to upload all of your information to the Azul data management program. So it's really efficient for the buyer, but it is expensive for the farmer, and you have to decide if it's worth it if they're requiring that of you. So Jeff, I believe you're next. If you want to switch screens. I'm going to stay up here so that I can interject.
Okay. All right. Give me a minute while I share my screen. Okay, so Lindsay's been talking a lot about GAP, and in the midst of all of this certification requirements by industry, the government got involved and came up with the Food Safety Modernization Act, which we refer to as FSMA, and we have a few more things to jump through. The GAP program is voluntary. Well, shouldn't say it's voluntary. It's required by your buyers. So the only reason to have a GAP audit is because you have a buyer that is requesting a GAP audit. FSMA has now come up with food safety requirements that are now the law of the land. And so there's this confusion sometimes, and it gets complex. And there's confusion on the part of farmers. There's even confusion on the part of buyers about what is required, what is not required. And I have farmers who tell me, well, I didn't think that my potatoes had to be were covered under FSMA, but my buyer says that I have to do this GAPS thing. And so we start mixing these two things together. GAPS is separate from FSMA. GAP requirement is a requirement of the buyer, and if they say that your pumpkins have to be third-party audited, then that's their requirement. But FSMA, as we'll get into, does not require that for pumpkins. So there's two different things that work here, and sometimes even when you talk to your buyers, there may be some confusion, especially with all the different things that Lindsay was talking about, all the different standards, the harmonized, the GAP-GIP, the GFSI. Sometimes you'll find that buyers, even large buyers, may be somewhat confused by some of that. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the FSMA, rule, the Food Safety Modernization Act. There are actually several parts of it. I think 5 or 6 or 7, 7 I think it was. If you look at all of them, it covers imported produce, it covers feed, but we're going to talk mostly about the produce safety rule. And if you're a grower, the produce safety rule is the primary one that is going to impact you. So some of the main requirements of the law, first of all, that you have to attend an FDA approved training. It's a once and done training. It is a very specific curriculum. A lot of growers have attended GAPS trainings over the years. This particular training has been approved by FDA, and regardless of how much background you've had in food safety or in GAPS, you need to attend this specific FDA training. It's a 7-hour training with about 270 slides, and we have to go through each and every one for you to get a certificate that says that you have attended that training, and then you are officially food safety FSMA certified. As I said, it's something you only have to do once, and one person from your farm has to attend that training. It requires systems and records. As Lindsay mentioned, record keeping is part of what we do. Part of what farmers have to do as part of FSMA. It does not require a food safety plan, but we highly recommend it because it does require that you have some procedures in place, and where do you put those procedures but in a food safety plan. So we encourage folks to have a food safety plan, but that is one of the differences between FSMA and the GAP audit. On a GAP audit, the first thing they will ask for is a food safety plan. If you don't have a food safety plan for a GAP audit, it's an automatic fail. But for FSMA, it's not as critical. And then with FSMA, instead of having a third-party GAP audit that you pay for, FDA will come out and do inspections. They would like to say they'll do that once a year. I'm not sure that'll happen, especially on small farms. But FDA has the right to come out and inspect your farm, inspect your paperwork, make sure that you're following the practices outlined in the law. So the difference between an inspection and an audit is primarily they're looking at the same things. An inspection doesn't cost you anything, an audit does. So that's part of the differences there. The other rule that we deal with is preventative controls for human food. This is the processing end of the business. So if you're processing anything or packing anything, well, we'll talk a little bit more about packing, but particularly if you're processing, doing any value added to the products you grow, you will fall under the preventative controls for human food. It requires a training, so you have to have somebody that's in management that has had that training. It requires that you register with the FDA as a facility, and of course FDA will come out and do inspections. And then there's the Sanitary Food Transport Act, which is requires standard operating procedures for cleanliness, temperature control, record keeping for over-the-road trucks and those who load them. So if you're transporting a lot of produce through the trucks over the highway, that will impact you a lot as well. Not so much for small growers. Primarily, this impacts more of the commercial transport companies that transport food. So FDA, as I mentioned, will have inspections. We're not sure how. As Lindsay mentioned, their budget is somewhat limited. In most states, I think 44 states now, they have agreements with the Department of Agriculture, the State Department of Agriculture. Here in Pennsylvania, that's how it will work. The Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture will be doing the inspections on behalf of FDA. Initially, their goal is to educate before they regulate, which means the first audit they do, at least initially, will be more of an educational audit, a consultative audit. They're going to come out, tell you what you would need to do to pass the law, but not necessarily issue any fines or anything like that the first time around. So you can request that if you want. They're going to try and have that up and running by the middle of summer this year. I'm not sure if that'll happen. They still haven't decided, again, the fee structure. I would anticipate the inspections will not have any cost to the grower. So where does the GAP audits that you have and the FSMA inspections intersect? It's certainly, if you're working with your buyer and he's requiring you to have a GAP auditor, you could have an audit one week, an inspection the following week, looking at the same thing, which would be kind of frustrating. There is talk in the future that those two things may work together, that if you have an audit, that eventually you may not have to have an inspection. That hasn't been worked out yet. But it would make sense in the future, especially as we look at the challenge of trying to get to all the farms that they need to get to. If you are being GAP audited, the audits will be in compliance with FSMA. If you've been audited in the past, there's nothing. There will eventually be nothing that will be more strict in FSMA than in the GAP audit. In other words, the GAP audits will adjust their audits to comply with the FSMA law. So the laws will not, the FSMA law will not be any stricter than a GAP audit. GAP audit schemes, on the other hand, may be more restrictive than FSMA. So that'll be part of the confusion as we go forward. Some farms may find that their GAP audit requires things that FSMA doesn't require. But as a minimum, most of the GAP audits will be compliant with FSMA. The water issues will probably be the thing where the GAP audits will have to change the most. And FDA at this point is still working on what those water requirements will be. So there are some exemptions from the produce rule. It doesn't cover everyone. If you sell less than $25,000 in gross vegetable sales, sales from produce over the last 3 years, then you are exempt from the produce rule, and you do not, it doesn't apply to you. If you grow only crops that are not consumed raw, we call the crops that are consumed raw covered crops. So this law covers things that are consumed raw. Things that are not consumed raw would be things like just about all of the beans, sweet corn, hard squash, potatoes, those kind of crops, pumpkins. Those things are not covered under FSMA. So when we talk about covered produce, and you may hear that term when people talk about FSMA, that's what we're talking about. Sweet corn, squash, beans, some of the asparagus is not considered to be covered produce. And then, in addition to those exemptions, we get into one that is a little more complicated. It's called the qualified exemption. And this one is for farms who have less than $500,000 in farm food sales. Food is defined as anything that's can be eaten by man or animal. So that could be alfalfa hay, that could be corn, soybeans, wheat, anything like that. So when you think of your total sales, now you don't just think about vegetables. Now you have to think about everything that's sold on the farm, the milk, the meat, the eggs, all those kind of things, except for maybe, I don't know, Christmas trees or greenhouse production, that kind of thing. As part of that exemption, 50% of your food must be sold to an end user who either consumes it or sells it to a consumer. So an end user is considered a consumer, of course, but also folks like stores and restaurants that sell directly to consumers. What it doesn't include is wholesalers. So if you sell produce and it goes to the distribution center of Walmart or Giant, that would be considered a wholesaler. If you sell it directly to a supermarket, where you go in the back door and they put it out on the aisle right away, that would be considered an end user. So it becomes a little bit more complicated. One of the things you're required under this exemption is that you must have your name and address of your farm on all the boxes. If you're selling at a CSA or a farmer's market, you need to have your name and address prominently displayed where folks can see it at the market. You're not required to keep track in any way of those consumers if you're selling direct to the consumer. If you're selling to a store or restaurant, you do need to keep track of where that produce goes. You still need to keep the logs and records that FSMA requires, so you're not exempt from that part of it. But you are exempt from the training. You're exempt from the inspection, the annual inspection.
But you need to go to the training to find out what the logs and records are.
Right, exactly. And so you don't really know all of this until you go to the training, which of course you're exempt from.
Yeah, because you can't get the information unless you go to the training.
And on top of that, then you have to keep a list of sales and buyers, of who you sold your produce to and how much for the last 3 years. And the exemption can be revoked if you get into if there is an illness or an outbreak or something goes wrong on your farm, they can revoke that exemption. So
and,
this
Jeff, you have a typo up here under, you say does include wholesalers. It should say doesn't include wholesalers.
Oh, sorry about that.
I can change that before we send it.
Okay. Yeah. And it actually is 50% of your food sales, not just your produce sales. I noticed the other typo there. So that it gets very muddy. This exemption is hardly worth it, in my opinion, because although you're exempt from training, as Lindsay mentioned, you almost need to go to the training. And it is a good training. We go through a lot of gaps things there as well. And so that's one of the things you're exempt from. And although you're exempt from the inspection, now they have to come out and check your records to see if you qualify for the exemption. So in essence, you're getting inspected to see if you qualify for the exemption. So I'm not sure what you're gaining a lot from this this exemption, but they put it in there anyway.
And Gary just asked me to say we will. The Pennsylvania Farmers Union will be hosting this PSA, Produce Safety Rule training, in the second year of the grant. So later this year and over the winter.
Yes, we've done 5 of these FSMA trainings around Pennsylvania this past year. I anticipate you'll see at least 10 of those probably being done this coming year. The Mid-Atlantic Vegetable Conference has one scheduled again for next January, into January or February, whenever the dates fall for the Hershey Vegetable Convention. So there are a lot of trainings out there. You can check our website, which I'll put up here at the end. Later in the year, you'll find some of those. The Produce Safety Alliance, the PSA, out of Cornell, they are charged with coordinating these trainings around the country and training the trainers. They also have a website that lists trainings that are coming up in the area. This is the timeline for becoming compliant. The regulation passed in 2011. The final rules came out in actually January of 2016. FDA spent a lot of time putting this regulation together, and there was a lot of comments that went into this regulation when they had their comment period. And so the large businesses, for the produce safety rule, those that are over $500,000 in sales of produce, not food now, we're back to produce, they have 2 years to come into compliance. So they have until January of next year, 2018, to be in compliance. What they call small businesses, farms of 250 to 500,000, have until January of 2019. Very small farms, those of 25 to 250,000, have until January of 2020. And then you have an additional 2 years to come into compliance with the water quality and testing standards that are outlined in the FSMA law. So the first growers that will need to be complying will be in January of next year for the 2018 growing season. Preventative controls rule, this is the one that covers any on-farm processing. So very small businesses, less than $1 million a year, have 2 years to come into compliance. So they have until January of next year. And so they need to keep records. Businesses subject to pasteurized milk ordinances, they have 3 years. I will mention that a lot of the pasteurized milk ordinance covers a lot of the things that FSMA does. FSMA will add a few extra things, but that's why they give them the extra year, because they're already doing a lot of what FSMA requires. Small businesses, those of fewer than 500 full-time employees, 1 year. And if you're thinking of a farm, that's a pretty big farm, but we're thinking of food processors. So we're thinking of businesses like Heinz, those kind of folks.
Just to clarify a little bit, so if you are doing on-farm value added, it's things like chopped greens or sliced carrots or anything that is more risky that bumps you up into the preventative controls regulation area. If you're drying herbs, or if you're making jams in a certified kitchen, that kind of thing isn't considered risky, so you don't have to worry about preventative controls. It's the fresh cut that gets things more complicated.
That's correct. And packing doesn't qualify you for preventative controls. That's part of the produce rule. If you're packing produce, if you're bringing tomatoes in, putting them in a box, shipping them out, that's considered packing. You can pack.
Make sure you cut your greens in the field, not in the packing house.
Right. Yeah. Unless you're doing trimming.
Right. Trimming's okay.
Yeah. And some of that gets into some gray areas with some of each individual crop as to what is considered, what makes it further processing, and what makes it just on farm racks. Raw agricultural product is the acronym they give to that. If you're some things like cutting leaves off of rhubarb, that's just considered part of packing, and that's not an issue. So it becomes an issue of where you do things and that kind of thing. You can pack other produce if you need to buy peppers from a neighbor to fill an order, as long as 50% or more of the produce that gets packed in your packing house is your product, then it's still considered part of the produce rule, and it's covered under that. You don't go into the preventative controls rule.
Also, you can pack in a packing house that's not on your farm, as long as it's owned 50% by a farmer, by you.
That's correct.
Or a farm cooperative, right?
Right. Even a cooperative that has a packing house and they're packing produce from 100 different farms, as long as those farmers own that packing house or own that business, they can rent the packing house if they want, but as long as they own that business, that falls under the farm and the produce rule, as long as they're doing 50% of the product is coming from the farmer owners of that packing shed. If you own a packing shed, if I would own a packing shed and I would pack Lindsay's produce, then I would fall under preventative controls if I wasn't packing my own produce there. So it gets a little gray in some of those areas, but that's primarily how we look at it. And if you really want to stretch your mind, this is a flow chart that Luke Laborde at Penn State put together to decide.
Kind of looks like a Dr. Seuss thing.
Yeah, exactly. To decide whether or not you're exempt. If you follow that, you can sort it all out. But as you can see, it's not going to be real easy to. It can get complicated. So it's voluntary versus market-driven versus the law. And FSMA is the law. So if your food enterprise is covered by one or more of the FSMA rules, you must meet those requirements. But customer demand kind of trumps all of that. If you can be exempt from the law, if your customer says that you are required to pass a gap audit, then you have to pass a gap audit. If your customer says that you have to go to the FSMA training, then that means you would have to go to the FSMA training. And we have had wholesalers in Pennsylvania tell their growers that they have to attend a FSMA training to sell to their store. So we have growers that, even though they're exempt because they're not producing products that are consumed raw, or maybe they're producing less than $25,000 in produce, they may still have to get a FSMA training if their customer requires it. At the end of the day, you still have to comply with your customer's requirements.
So a question, is ServSafe certification enough, or do you still need to do preventative control training? So if you're covered by, if you have to comply with the preventative controls, then you have to do the training. Somebody in the organization has to be a qualified individual under preventative controls. ServSafe is, it doesn't exempt you from having to do the preventative controls training.
Yeah, that's correct. ServSafe is geared primarily to the restaurant industry and food preparation, and that's true with these laws. They want you to go to their specific training. As I mentioned, we've done GAPS training, Penn State and Lindsay and I have done that for years. And even though the FSMA training is primarily a GAPS training, they do require that you go to this specific training. So these trainings are very specific. When you go to those, you'll get a certificate that says that you've attended the the produce safety rule training or the preventative controls rule training, and that's what they require. They don't allow us to substitute other trainings. We could have a PhD in microbiology. I'd still have to attend the produce rule training. So.
And there are buyers now who are saying they're going to require for farmers to be FSMA compliant. They usually don't know what they mean by that.
Right.
And they just want to make sure that they're, that the food they're getting is following the regulation. Right now, that just means you've attended the PSA grower training.
That's correct.
That at some point it may mean that you have to have an FDA inspection, but for now it's just the grower training.
A lot of the GAPS requirements are driven by risk. When they look at the outbreaks that we've had, the lawsuits that haven't resulted, the stores are very concerned about going to court because someone has gotten sick or worse, and they want to make sure that when they're on the stand that they can say that all of their suppliers meet the government regulations. And so that's why I think a lot of them are beginning to require FSMA training for their growers.
All right, so I'm going to zip through all this and get to this one. Okay. So we've been taking our time here. We're getting out to 1:22. So I'm going to zip through this pretty quickly, just a few slides. So you find out that your customer requires a GAP certificate. First thing you need to do is find out if they know what they're talking about. So do they know what kind of food safety standard they require? Is there a certification body? So for instance, they could say you need to be Primus GFS. Then you've got to find out who would come out and do the audit for you. And if a customer knows that much, they probably know who they want you to have come out and do the audit. And then don't ask them if there's a data management program that you have to upload information to. Wait until they tell you that, because you don't want to do it unless they tell you. And then, as is often the case, especially with smaller farmers, the customer doesn't really know. They just want to know that they can see a certificate, in which case you get to choose which standard, which audit program, which certification body you want to work with. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you're getting trained. The PSA training, as Jeff said, does include pretty generally the good agricultural practices information that you'll get at any GAP training. It weaves the regulation through it, but certainly in Pennsylvania, Penn State is really just doing PSA training at this point, not regular GAPS training. There are some other folks, including me, that do GAPS training from time to time, and Jeff will do those with me too. So go to a training or two, get yourself familiar. Then you're going to need to write a plan, and there are some plan writing workshops that happen here and there. If you can find one, Jeff and I did one of those this year for PASA. And I've done some in Delaware and Maryland. So you can look around for those. But you do need to write a plan if you want to get certified. And you need to implement that plan. And as I said earlier on, writing a plan or developing a food safety manual includes the plan and keeping records, keeping documentation on the requirements. So it's more than just writing the plan. You then need to implement the plan. And once you have that going, you've trained your workers, you've done all the things that you need to do so that you feel comfortable, then you would schedule the audit. And when you're writing a plan, the easiest way to get started is to borrow somebody else's plan, quite honestly. That helps you to see the kinds of things that you need to put into the plan. Hang on, I'm trying to get back to my notes here. You want to go and see what other farmers are doing who have already been food safety audited. So that's also very helpful. before you schedule the audit. And when you schedule an audit, you want to make sure you have the auditor coming when you're at the busiest time of year, basically, when you're harvesting and post-harvest handling as many different products at once, so they can see as many different procedures and processes at one time, so that you can get audited for all of those things. A USDA harmonized audit will cover you for any number of things you want to put in there. They don't have to come out separately for each item. They can see multiple products at once, as long as they have the opportunity to see you harvesting and packing and whatever else, washing, whatever it is that you do to those products. And what they're really doing is auditing the process as much as they are auditing the product. So if you are growing a number of things that you harvest and process exactly the same way, they don't have to see all of those things. They just need to see that one process. So for instance, if you are growing a lot of different greens, cooking greens, they don't need to see every single cooking green. They just need to see one, and then they'll be able to say, okay, they can sign off on all of the different cooking greens that you harvest and process that way. And I already said that one. And if you can find a mock audit, go to a mock audit. That's really helpful. You can ask questions. If Jeff is doing mock audits, or if I'm doing mock audits, we can actually answer your questions. Unfortunately, the PDA folks can't really answer questions because they're regulators, but since we're educators, we can answer your questions. And then people ask, how long does it take? So it really depends how stringent the food safety audit program it is that you have to follow, how big and complex. So if all you're doing is, so the co-op that Jeff works with a lot, they grow 3 different products: onions, squash, cauliflower. They're relatively low risk crops, and everything goes to a packing shed. So the on-farm process is relatively simple. But if you are growing many different crops, and you're washing and packing those crops and storing those crops on your farm, then you have more complexity to deal with in your food safety plan, and operations will be more complex. So again, it takes more time to understand where your risks are and how you're going to mitigate those risks, and keep records of everything. Also, how much training do you need? If you've already done a bunch of training, then GAP certification won't take as long. If you're starting from zero, then you need to factor in, really, you need a winter to be able to understand and get trained and learn how to write a plan. This is the same kind of thing. It depends how much you understand about food safety, how much time and energy you have or your workers have, whether you need to hire someone. Like me, I will come in and actually work one-on-one with farmers and help them write their food safety plan. I don't do it for them, because if you write a food safety plan for someone and hand it to them, they're not really likely to implement it. But it depends how much you want to spend or how much capacity you have internally to get the work done. So I talked about that already. So, and then how much will it cost? Again, it depends. There's a whole lot of it depends in food safety, I will say. It's a little frustrating for those of us that help people out, but it can be very difficult to give definitive answers. So the biggest challenge is to your brain and your routine. Once you get over having to do it, things speed up quite a bit. And if you can get things into your routine, that really helps. And people do. It's usually not as scary or as overwhelming or as expensive, actually. You usually don't need to make really expensive improvements. You might want to, but usually for more than just food safety reasons. You might want to make your operation more efficient, which will also, and the improvements that you make will help to make it more food safe. So if you are making any improvements, think about how it can be, how it can also add to food safety mitigation. And generally speaking, if you're looking at your operation more deeply, it will help with efficiency and higher quality, especially if you're training your workers to think a bit more about how they're handling product. It can really add to higher quality. And it does help if you give yourself some time and don't try and do it all in a matter of months. The co-op that I worked with down in Mississippi, we had to get them certified within 5 months the first time around. And really, yes, we got them certified, but then it's been another year of actually getting them to thoroughly implement food safety. So give yourself some time, give your workers some time to get used to the whole idea. And you want to have everybody engaged. It's not enough that one person is taking on food safety. Everyone has to take it seriously. Everyone has to get some training in food safety that's appropriate to their role. And then you have to decide if it costs too much. You know, if because of the complexity or because your customer wants you to do a really rigorous food safety audit program, it might just be too much. It might not be worth it to sell to that customer. So again, with what I'm talking about here is getting GAP certified. It's not FSMA, it's not the produce safety rule, it's getting GAP certified because your customer requires it. So again, someone has to do the work. You can do it yourself. You can outsource a certain amount of it, but you can't outsource actually implementing the food safety program. And the cost of the third-party audit will vary. USDA chart, or it's actually in Pennsylvania, it would be PDA that does the audit, and they charge $92 an hour, including travel. So you want to make it you want to get all of your ducks in a row, so when they show up on the farm, you can get through that audit as quickly as possible. So you're not paying $92 an hour for them to you know, watch you try and find your receipts for your chemicals, for instance. So you get everything ready. And, you know, that's where it can help to have someone, a consultant come in and help you get ready, but you don't have to. If you've got your act together, you can do it yourself. And then most departments of ag will provide cost sharing for the audit. So if you have a successful audit, I believe in Pennsylvania, they will reimburse you $400 towards the audit cost. In Maryland, they reimburse more than that. It differs from state to state. So final words here. You can't, as I said before, you can't just put one person in charge and walk away and expect it to be fail-safe. You really have to engage everyone, and everyone needs to be educated, including the eaters. It's a critical business decision. What are your business goals? Who do you want to sell to? Is it worth the risk to ignore food safety? You could literally lose the farm if you make someone sick or if you kill someone, and it's a criminal offense too. So it's not something you want to ignore. And the audit is not the end game. A consistent implemented system is the goal. The Jensen Farm cantaloupe debacle is really a good example of this, where they had a over 90% pass on their food safety audit, and they still made people sick, and people died from the listeria on their cantaloupes. So it's not sufficient to just pass your audit. You really do need to make this part of your everyday, every minute operations. And then it is a journey of continuous improvement, and you learn as you go, and you take it step by step. The auditors will they're not going to fail you unless you do something grossly wrong, and they will give you improvements to make for next year. So the key is that it becomes familiar and part of your daily routine. Jeff, Penn State food safety websites. You want to talk about these?
Sure. We have a couple websites up. Thanks. Our general food safety is the foodsafety.psu.edu/gaps. We have information there on some sample food safety plans if you want to see a sample plan or a plan template. So we have some of that kind of stuff up there if you're interested in gaps and getting a food safety plan and getting ready for training. We have some sample logs and things like that. The other website we have, I'm not sure why we have two, but we do. The FSMA but the other one focuses primarily on FSMA. The trainings and workshops coming up, there's some things there, some videos that explain the exemptions in a little better detail than what we were able to today. So that's at extension.psu.edu /FSMA. So those two websites will give you some of the resources that we've put up there for food safety training.
And for a previous version of this webinar, I had a whole list of resources that we sent out to everybody along with the PDF version of this presentation. So I'm sure we can do that again this time. Yana, you can let me know if you need me to resend you that information. I still have it. So we are PFU is working with Jeff and I to provide more education going forward. I'm hoping that the National Farmers Union will give us the funding for me to be able to do more one-on-one coaching with people, which is really, I mean, Jeff and I really agree that's one of the most valuable things that we're able to do for folks, because it just helps you get from A to Z much more quickly. And I'm able to do that. I also have templates for food safety plans, records, and SOPs, the same as I have my own versions of what Penn State has on the website. And as Heidi said earlier, I have quite a lot of experience and interest in helping people work together in groups to become certified. There's a couple of different ways you can do that. And we're also always talking about how we could bring Group GAP to the region or to the state. It is happening in other parts of the country. But it's not happening yet in Pennsylvania, but maybe it will. So that's us. We still have 24 minutes for questions if anybody has questions. Is anybody out there?
I think we're down to Jennifer.
Are we? Oh, there's something flashing at me. All right.
While you're reading that, Lindsay, I just want to note, this is Yona. Thank you so much for that awesome information. You covered so much, so thoroughly, and gave a whole bunch of leads for further information, which I'll work with Heidi to send out. And Heidi, just want to note that if you unmute yourself, now would be a great time to just go through any of the questions that came in.
Yeah, so one of the questions I see, one of the questions is, what distinguishes a FSMA audit from a GAP audit, and how do you request a mock FSMA audit, and is there a charge for that?
Jeff, I'm going to let you handle that one.
Yeah. So the PDA, Pennsylvania Department of Ag, is doing the FSMA. What do they call them? It's the inspection.
The consultative and
consultative inspection, kind of a mock audit, mock inspection, and actually it's the same folks who do the or you would contact the same folks who do the harmonized or the GAP-GIP audits for PDA. So it would be Brenda Schaefer, or probably Brenda would be the one you would talk to. Eventually, PDA is in the process of hiring a lot of folks right now. Eventually, they may separate their FSMA inspectors from their GAP auditors, but for now, it's going to be the same people. So yeah, I would do that through Brenda Schaefer at the Pennsylvania Department of Ag.
And is there a cost to that?
No, I don't think there is. You could check when you call them, but I don't think there is any cost associated with the inspections, since that is it's a regulatory program. I guess it's a law, so I don't think there's any cost with those inspections. But be a good question.
I heard that there might be a cost if you fail your inspection, but I don't
Okay.
think they've decided that yet.
Yeah, but these initial inspections, there won't be any passing or failing. I think it's just kind of an educational thing. So I think they're looking actually to do some of those. So yeah, I would give them a call.
Thank you. Another question, Justin, from Jennifer, formulas for the water testing data sets.
Yeah. So we didn't wade into the water testing, but as you know, Jennifer, that's a big part of FSMA. FDA will come out with those. The word now is that FDA is looking very hard at the water testing requirements in FSMA. They've gotten a lot of feedback from farms all over the scale, all over the country, about their water testing requirements. I expect to see some changes in those within the next year. When I talked to the folks at PSA, at Cornell, who worked very closely with FDA, they said it could be a month from now, it could be a year from now. They're not real sure. But I would anticipate some changes to that before the dust settles. So we're all kind of holding off on putting out any formulas for standard deviations and geometric means and those kind of things that are currently required in the law.
PSA does have, they do have resources for you to figure that stuff out. If you go to the Produce Safety Alliance website and search for that, they do have it if you want to go there early.
Yeah, it's true. They may already have the things out, the formulas out for the current law. Yeah, check the PSA website.
And just getting back to the difference between a GAP audit and an FDA inspection, you don't necessarily want to request an FDA inspection until, I don't think you want to go after that kind of thing necessarily, unless your customer says you need to.
Mm-hmm.
But the GAP certification you will do because your customer requires it. GAP audit and certification.
Thank you, Jeff and Lindsay. And I want to remind people too that Pennsylvania Farmers Union and Chesapeake Food Shed Network will be presenting again on Friday, May 19th with Lindsay and Jeff between 9 and 10:30 a.m. We'll be offering part 2 of this, where to begin and on-farm lessons learned. I don't see any more questions, so.
Either we've confused them sufficiently or they already knew all this and they didn't need to sit here at all.
I think it was a great educational webinar. Thank you, Lindsay and Jeff.
You're welcome.